pictures. One is of my dad with my oldest two, and one is of my dad with a young Lutheran pastor. I'll tell a story about that picture during my presentation. So my subject is my father being a pastor and confidant. And actually, what I'm really going to talk about is the way that my dad taught me to be a pastor. Most of the time, neither he nor I knew that he was teaching me how to be a pastor. It's only looking back over time that I realized how much he taught me about the work of being a pastor. I didn't know I would be a pastor until I was 22 years old, but God knew. And in our everyday moments, my father, driving me in carpool, he would talk over scripture that he was studying, sermon ideas and illustrations, decisions that he was making, dilemmas he was working on, never betraying people's confidences. And he let me see a pastor's thought process and a pastor's heart. I wanted to share with you some of the many ways my father taught me how to be a pastor. This will be kind of a patchwork talk, but I think when we're done, you'll have a whole quilt. And you understand that every time I talk about being a good pastor, I'm talking about my dad. My father loved being a pastor. He loved being your pastor. He loved the Lord and learned from him how to be a good shepherd. And like him, my father was endlessly intrigued and fascinated by people of every different kind, and he loved to care for them and find out about them. He saw beyond the details into your hearts. He was curious about people's stories of their lives, and he loved helping people to know how God was moving in the stories of their lives. He really listened. Even though he was a great talker, he was also a great listener, which is a rare combination. He would remember details of a person's life and recall them whenever he saw them. He remembered names, relationships, troubles, hopes, and dreams. Like the Good Shepherd, he recognized every sheep, and everyone who counted my father as their shepherd, their pastor, knew his voice and his love for them. Even the best pastor has flaws. He had a hard time as a pastor letting others help him to accomplish things. He had a hard time not stepping in and doing everything himself. He had a hard time with stopping and resting and stepping back. He had a hard time not going full out all the time. And as with us all, his flaws were the opposite side of some of his best qualities. So let me start telling you about what a good pastor is. And I'm aware that I'm making gestures off to the right. And nothing I can do about it. A good pastor thinks big. And by that I mean he or she lets their heart expand and forgiveness and grace abound with people in trouble. He lets go of seeing people in only a human, flawed way, and he lets God teach him how to see people from a God's eye view. He was tender and forgiving with people, as a good pastor should be. When there was a baby who needed to be adopted, he received the young unmarried mother and the baby in his office. He met with her, he prayed with her, he reassured her, and then he waited in his office with the baby for the adoptive family to come and pick up their new little one. Thinking big means reaching out to those that others fear or hate. My father visited with a dying gay AIDS patient in that infectious disease hospital on Ponce in a time when many were saying that was a judgment on them from God and shunning them. And yes, he did not find scriptural support for affirming that life, but he pastorally and beautifully visited that man dying of AIDS. Being a pastor means being big. Once, when at a fireside chat, someone asked him, "What do you think of women pastors?" Another person spoke up and said, "He's against them." He quietly said, "Not so fast. Don't speak for me. No reason why a woman can't be a pastor." He had convictions based on scripture and our faith, but he was never mean-spirited or cruel, and he did not rejoice in criticizing or puncturing others. And by the way, he said that about women in the ministry long before I ever dreamed of being a pastor. Being a pastor who thinks big means that you see others more and more as God sees them. so that you speak and care for a simple, everyday person the same as a very fancy, important person, because you remember that God has no partiality. He took the same delight in all kinds of people. He was as intrigued about talking with a waiter in a restaurant as he was a Fortune 500 CEO. That's because he was letting God make him big inside, and he learned to see people with a God's eye view. One story that helps me to remember how to be a big person is this one. This is probably 3 or 4 years before he died. We were here in town, and I was sitting out back with him in the swing behind their house where we always got eaten up with mosquitoes, and he was never bitten. I don't know how that works. But I was talking about someone who's not a member here who I had heard teach a class, and I was criticizing her and saying what a silly job she had done, and he listened, and he swung, and he listened, and finally he said, "Are you finished?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Let me tell you about her life." And he began to tell me about the things that had shaped her, the things that had hurt her, the things she had struggled against, and how that had all made her the person that she was. And I saw in that speech that he made to me, he never reproached me, by the way. He never said, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way, you shouldn't have said that." But he simply opened up her life for me to think about. And I saw her, as he did, from a God's eye view. Being a pastor means you're striving for that God's eye view of the people you're caring for. But being a pastor means saying no sometimes, setting biblical limits with kindness. It means speaking the truth in love. There's a story that he told me once, and he didn't tell me the people involved, but I then later heard it from the woman who's in the story, so I can tell it to you. She said that she had this is an older lady, and she had a gentleman friend who had proposed to her. And when he proposed, he said, "I want you to sign a prenuptial." And this was in the early days of that one. That was really very unheard of. And she said, "What do you mean?" And he explained it to her, and she didn't feel right about it. So she said, "I want us to go and speak to my pastor." He said, "Fine, whatever." So they came in and spoke with my dad. And they were sitting there in his office, and he talked to her, and then he sort of interviewed and asked the gentleman questions. And when the hour was up, he said, "Well, thank you for coming to see me. And Julia, I would not marry him if he were the last man on earth." I'm sitting right there. And he said, "I would not sign that. And if you decide that you are going to sign it and do want to have a wedding, I won't be able to perform it." And he stood up and ushered them to the door, and they broke up in the hall. And that gentleman probably at the end of that same month got another lady to sign the prenup and married her. And it didn't last very long. So being a pastor means saying no sometimes. Being a pastor means that you do not always have the answers, and you must be honest about them. It means that sometimes you turn to a family and say over a hospital bed with a desperately and permanently injured adult child, as my father did, "I don't know what to pray for here." They were mad at him at the time, by the way, but they later understood what he meant. It means that sometimes, as my dad did, you turn to a colleague after an especially sad funeral and say, "I felt that my words just went up to the ceiling and then fell on the floor." Being a pastor means acknowledging sorrow and mystery. Yet still you have faith in God that you model for others that helps you get up and keep living and leading with joy. It's not easy sometimes. Being a pastor, though, means being honest about the gaps in our understanding and about the real grief and anger that comes even to people of great faith. My father once said to someone on the day of a great tragedy, "You can let this break you, or you can let this make you, with God's help." He acknowledged the tragedy and the possibility of real collapse, but also the hope of letting God use the circumstance to make that person's life strong. And the person who told me that story had taken the second option, letting it make him. Being a pastor of a big church especially means you know all the possible ways things can go wrong and all the big city trouble that people get involved in. This can make you a very nervous father of teenage daughters, as my father was. Anyone who thinks a big city pastor is an innocent, sheltered soul is very much mistaken. We see it all, and he did too. Being a pastor means going in when the times are hard, when the balcony collapses and the guests are injured, when the economy collapses, when the gunshot goes off in a home office and the new widow calls and asks you to go in and see what has happened. It means being a pastor when someone is drunk yet again and still needs to go to rehab, when someone has drunk driven and hurt someone. Being a pastor means you shelter beaten and abused women and children in your office and in your home. It means you visit people in the locked mental ward and in jail. And when a dear friend is dying, being a pastor means that you go in and suffer with them. When my dad would come home and say, well, I was a full service pastor today. When he would say this, he would be thinking, and it was almost too much for me today. I know that feeling. Being a pastor means that you go for redemption. How can we salvage this relationship or this situation? As a pastor, you do your best to repair relationships and hurts that others perceive that you have caused them. It can be very hard to let someone go, but sometimes that does happen. Sometimes he would get a call from an irate person who would use the threat of leaving the church to try to get him to do what they wanted. He would listen very carefully and very kindly, and sometimes he would say, where can we send your church letter? Sometimes being a pastor means letting someone go their own way, and sometimes they come back. Being a pastor means you look for ways to help people see the holiness in their everyday efforts and work. How does the word get lived out in an everyday life? His very early insight about how to help the man in his first church in Hinesville who ran the gas station, how could he as a pastor help that man to pump gas every day? That stuck with him when his parishioners did much fancier things than pump gas. He would still think, how can I help them to know the holiness of their everyday lives and work? Being a pastor means that sometimes you get righteously indignant and let people know they have done wrong. And this story has to do with another area church in town. And he was friends with the pastor and many of the elders at that church. And they had a retired pastor who lived still in town. He had retired from that church, lived in town. He was in very poor health. His wife was dying. And the church, through some oversight, I'm sure, had not let them have enough money to have heat in their house. And he found out. And what do you think he did? He called the wealthiest elder in that church, who he knew was clerk of session, and blasted him out. That's what. I heard it, and it just made my ears melt. And I would have been happy not to be that man on the other end of the phone. But the man did what was right. He reached out to that couple and made sure that they were cared for. And my father checked back later to make sure that he had followed through. So being a pastor means sometimes you get righteously indignant. Sometimes being a pastor means people call you to have wrong things sorted out. It's a little like being an Old Testament judge or patriarch. People have a dilemma in the family. No one knows what to do. Judge, you know about this, don't you? They think they will bring it to their pastor before it has to come to a judge, huh? As my dad said, people have a touching trust that you will help them. And as he would say, this leans on you. So he would always try. Sorting out what your judgment will be takes creativity and kindness. He had those qualities. Being a pastor, though, sometimes means that neither party is happy with what you decided. There was a family, and the daughters in the family, after the death of one of the parents, were having a hard time dividing up possessions, and it all came down to this one antique chair. And one daughter wanted it and the other daughter wanted it. And they got into such a fight and disagreement about it that they couldn't resolve it. And so they brought it, they called my dad and said, would you help us to resolve this? And he said, sure. And he said, bring it with you. So they dragged this chair, this carved black wooden chair, and it was an evil-looking chair. It had these eagle heads on it and weird feet, you know. So they brought it in and they set it down. They said, this is the chair that we both want. He said, all right, tell me why it should be you. And he listened to that girl. And then he said, tell me why it should be you. He listened to her, and he looked at them both, and he said, I have decided what to do. This is my chair now. And he kept it. So sometimes being a pastor means that you help people to sort things out, and they have to abide by what you say. A good pastor not only works for the health of his church, he works for and supports other churches too. My dad would set up a Peachtree member who was moving to another city with a great church in that area. He would write the pastor at that church, inform them of how to get in touch with this member, and tell them they're a wonderful member, you should reach out to them. A good pastor is a friend to other pastors, knowing that there are not many other people a pastor can let down their hair with, talk about their real lives, their real hurts and strains. He had many friends around the world who were pastors in other denominations. He knew pastors need a pastor. He often sat with pastors who were suffering. When he was on vacation, they would come to see him and talk with him. He helped young pastors often, bringing them in to sit and talk with him in the office about decisions they were making, or their education, or their new churches. And the picture that I passed around with the young woman in the cassock, you can see neither of their faces, but his arm is around her, and they're in a Lutheran church. That young woman, when it was time for her ordination here in town, her bishop, or whatever they have in the Lutheran church, is that right? I don't know what they have. But anyway, he said, who would you like to do your ordination sermon? And she said, oh, I don't know. He said, well, who in your wildest dreams would you want to do your ordination sermon? And she said, Dr. Harrington. So he called my dad, and my dad said, I would love to do that. And so he did, and that picture that I passed around is of them on that day. So a good pastor is a friend to other pastors. A good pastor prepares. I thought about this as I was typing this up. He or she does not get up in front of people without studying and working hard on whatever they're presenting. He was very disappointed when he invited a noted pastor to speak here, and that man did not prepare. He just got up and winged it very poorly. And afterwards, my dad said he missed a great opportunity, and he was never invited back again. A good pastor considers his audience and tailors what he has to say to them. Paul did this, by the way, if you think about it. A long time ago, when I graduated from Princeton Seminary, my father was invited to do the baccalaureate there, and I worried he would not know how to speak to a bunch of Ivy League people. But in 1 minute, he had them eating out of his hand. I should never have worried. They did not know what hit them. He unleashed that beautiful Southern accent. In under 2 minutes, he had cited Abraham Lincoln, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then he told them what he knew and loved about being a pastor. It was brilliant. I should never have worried that he did not know how to adjust to his audience. Now, I've just said a good pastor needs to prepare, needs to consider their audience, but a good pastor also needs to know how to speak to a group with no preparation whenever he or she is asked to have a word. When my husband and I were first married, we lived outside of Philadelphia, and we attended Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church there on the main line. Very fancy church. And my father came to visit once, and he came to some sort of officers meeting where we were present, and he tagged along. And my pastor saw him sitting there and thought, it's stewardship season, and I'm afraid to speak about stewardship to these people. I think I'll ask him to do it. And so he said, Dr. Harrington, and he introduced him, and he said, we would love for you to have a word with us about stewardship. And my dad said, I would be happy to do that. And he stood, and he thought for a moment, and then he lifted his head and gave the best talk on stewardship from the heart and just from his experience that you've ever heard. And these people were used to the pastor only mentioning giving in a very, cringy and embarrassed way. But my father, as you well remember, was very bold about stewardship. And after he had spoken for about 3 minutes, people started shifting around, and you could tell they kind of were ready to give. If he had passed the plate, I think they would have had a good pledge from that officer's group. So a good pastor needs to be able to get up and speak on the spur of the moment. A good pastor needs to know when to scrap everything and just go with current events. Being a pastor means knowing what everyone needs to hear and saying it for us all. He would lay aside a sermon to respond to current events when that was needed. He knew that modeling a way to respond to current events as a Christian was a very important thing to do. A good pastor does not ask things of others he or she isn't willing to do himself or herself, meaning that when he asked you to give money, he was also giving, and probably more than you. Did you know that? When he died, we found a list of people's names who might be asked to give to a certain project, and at the top of the list was his name, and he was giving more than anyone else he had on the list. So a good pastor doesn't ask things of others they're not willing to do themselves. A good pastor does not try to fake a persona. A good pastor is really himself or herself. When my father first came here, people criticized him for not being buckhead enough, for being too country. He had one lady who brought an elocution chart and a pointy stick, set it up on an easel in his office, and tried to drill him and change the way that he sounded. But he remained authentically himself. And then, of course, Buckhead came around to him anyway. A good pastor uses the scars of his or her own life to help them to be an even better pastor. His cancer, his bypass, his physical frailty, he let those things make him more observant of other people's struggles. He became more tender-hearted, which he called being a mush bucket. After he had cancer for years, we could not get through a blessing over a meal without him crying. And I've noticed myself, that I am a mush bucket too. A good pastor, a really good pastor, keeps on having an effect long after he's gone. When someone has lived full out from the heart, being a good shepherd, he does not stop having an effect on the flock he leaves behind. More than once, I have stopped before going into a home or hospital room and mentally thought, what would he do in this situation with this family? I know what he might do or say, and so do you, because he lived that out in front of us. More than one time, I have heard his voice giving me the right words to say. For example, when our elder James Cross called me a few years ago, before he was a member, to say, my son was an Atlanta police officer and he was killed in the line of duty last night. Then he said, we don't have a church home. And I heard a voice saying, you do now. And he and his wife Teresa joined our church, and they are important and valuable members to this day. Now, pastor, when he says, and with this I close, better do that pretty quickly. With this I close. A pastor, a good shepherd, gives you everything you need to be a good shepherd yourself. And yes, I don't just mean me, I mean you too. Your pastor taught you every day how to care for others with respect, with kindness, with careful listening, with redemption, telling the truth in love, forgiving, and being authentic. You know how to do that now. And the secret of our faith is you can and should do that now. Remember the priesthood of all believers? That's what it means. You can do this too. To honor him and the good shepherd behind him, you be a good shepherd too. And with that, I close. Now, I know know you want to ask questions, and I'm ready to go. And we have plenty of time.
Did he ever come close to accepting another job? Not another church?
Yes. But his reason was that he was getting tired here. And he thought maybe a smaller place would be more manageable. And we talked about that. And first of all, my mother said, I'm not going anywhere else. And second of all, we talked about that, and he said, I said to him, you know, when you go there, you will still be yourself. And that church will get bigger and more complicated, and you will be just as tired. And I think he decided that was true, that a smaller church would become bigger and more complicated once he got there, and he was already low on energy, so he thought he would stay with us. And also, he hated leaving. The only time, the first time I ever saw him cry was when he had to tell his church in North Augusta he was leaving. And he just cried. He said, I never want to do this again. So he never had to do this again. He never had to leave us. Doug?
Vicki, I would add two things to your excellent list that Frank had.
There are lots of things that could be added.
Yeah, one, I think a good pastor is relatable, and he was the most relatable guy I've ever met. As you said, he reached out to everybody. He welcomed people, whatever condition they were in, but he was one of the most fun people. And I think there was just a joy about him that people felt when he was around. He was like a kid and laugh. The other thing is, and you have to have this, is a sense of equilibrium. You, to me, have the most challenging job, arguably, in the church, because you have to go.
And now I don't have Dr. Steve to help me. So y'all pray for me.
From funerals to births to sick people, and how, just on an emotional level, do you maintain that kind of equilibrium so you're just not crying here and it's almost like a manic depressive, really up, really down?
Well, I have to remember that even though I'm caring for this family, this is not my hurt today. This belongs to them. And to sort of horn in on it and feel it all myself at their level seems kind of selfish in a way. And so that's one way that I handle it. I don't know whether that makes sense. But I have to remember this belongs to them. It's not mine, and I shouldn't horn in on it. I don't know whether that makes sense. And he also felt especially after many years here when he knew everyone so well and so many of the people he was helping were his dear friends. That was hard on him. And so when he would come home and say, I was a full service pastor today, I would know that means the tank is empty now. And he has to recharge.
One of the things that I most admire about your father was the Wednesday night reading through the Bible.
Right.
He'd get that rocking chair up there and he'd take roll.
Yes.
And then he'd just read through from where he stopped the last week and just continue on and take about some vignette about something that he had experienced along the way. Where did that come about? I've never seen it before.
I'm not sure I know how it started, but I've sat in on it before, and it was like watching a violin virtuoso play the violin. Even though it was just him and the Bible, it was perfect, wasn't it? And he would just let his mind go on the subject that was mentioned in the scripture. And the one that I sat in on once was some terrible old passage from Leviticus about what you should do with a dead body if you find it. Would you believe it? And he made that amazing because he talked about funeral practices in Atlanta when he first moved here, and then what they had become over time. And so it was a fascinating journey through the way we remember and treat a dead loved one from 1971 to whenever he was speaking, which was in the 90s. So that's what he did with it. He just let his long experience play out in those times, and it was amazing. Miss Jean, you had a question.
Well, I just wanted to say that one time I heard your father, well, he was talking to us, and he said, we asked him about being the minister, and he said, one of the most difficult parts of being a minister was the roller coaster of emotions that you went through during the day, because you might have a happy birth in the morning and then a funeral, and then a beautiful wedding, and then you'd have to go take care of someone who had just been in a horrible accident.
Yep, that's so true.
And that was, to me, was the first time I had ever thought of what a minister would go through during.
Because you have to be open to whatever's happening in your flock. I had a day like that on Friday. I sat for probably 5 hours with 2 different families planning their loved one's funeral. And then I dragged my carcass home and found the kindest little thank you note from someone and some flowers, and it just made my day. And you know, I'm surprised I don't have the thank you note just clasped to my heart still. It really made a big difference to me. So you were right. There is a roller coaster.
I remember his depth of knowledge, and it was really, I guess, before much of the internet and Google this and Google that.
Yes.
Did he have somebody on staff that
No.
really would research stuff?
No. Never.
I mean, because he said something to me one time that nobody knew,
Right.
and I don't know how he knew.
That library, you know, was his library. And then there are books that weren't in that library that I still have. So he was an encyclopedic reader. He was a voracious reader. He read everything. He read history, he read biographies, he read theology, he read counseling, he read all kinds of things. He read for fun. He might read a spy novel or a what are those Zane Grey cowboy books?
Westerns.
And his very favorite book was Lonesome Dove. Along those lines. He just loved that book. And he loved the movie too. And he also loved going to the movies, especially, and this is one of the ways that a pastor balances the roller coaster of things they go through in a day. Near the end of a hard day, he would slam the book shut and he would say to another staff member, "Let's go to the movies, and I want to see something violent." So he read everything, and he also remembered everything. And he had things marked, he had things color-coded, he had little slips of paper that said what this is. Inside the cover of a book he had really liked, he had left himself notes about how this could be used. And as sermons began to gel, he would have piles of stuff that were going to be in each sermon. And by the time he got the sermon manuscript finished, by the way, someone said to me yesterday, "Your father never used a single note." That's not right. He had lots of notes and he wrote everything out. But he also had alternate stories that if something didn't go over well, he would think, "Well, I'm scrapping that one, but I have another one in line ready to go. Let's see how that works at the next service."
Vicki, the thing that I love about your dad is that he would preach on, if something would happen on Thursday or
Yes.
Friday, he didn't have a years of canned sermon that never changed, no matter what. He would change. If something happened that was
That
relevant,
was big.
it was in his sermon.
Yes.
And he
That's
spoke to
one
what
of
was happening in your life.
That's right. Because it's important to show people and to think through with people, how does a Christian react to this event that transpired this week? So you're right, he would do that. Let's see, I've skipped you and then I'll do you, Brown.
I was just gonna say, to me, it's important to be able to take what the preacher says and actually take it out in your day-to-day life. And we're talking about stewardship season, and he always would say, "Don't give till it hurts, give till it feels good."
Yes.
And I would use that, I started using that at
That
work
he used
for our
that line
charity
at
drive.
Bryn Mawr, by the way, when he was talking to them about stewardship, they were like, "Oh."
Yeah, and my giving just went up. It was great.
He had a devastating stewardship sermon that he did one year where he took an apple and he pared it in pieces that correspond to what percentage of their available funds do Americans spend on different things. And he put, household expenses, and he put entertainment, and he put, then last of all, he had charity, and that was the core. That was the leftover crummy core, and he flung it into a offering plate. People were like, "Oh." but we did well that year. He actually had a repeat of that with a banana once, and the peel got flipped into the plate. Brown, what did you want to say?
Was there a minister that influenced him?
There were plenty of ministers that influenced him. I know because he read everyone and he thought through everything. So I know that he admired Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, and we had him here to speak, and he did a beautiful job, by the way. So he was not the pastor I cited in that story. Many black pastors influenced him. His childhood pastor influenced him, whose name I don't remember right now. But when we had those historical Sundays where people would dress up like in bygone days, he was dressing up as his childhood pastor in a tailcoat and a ascot tie. That was his childhood pastor.
I was out in California when the Crystal Cathedral was
Right.
and my family went to church out there, and I was surprised about how well Frank was known. I had written on their sign-in card that I was from Atlanta, Peachtree Presbyterian. Who's from Peachtree Presbyterian? How's Frank doing?
That's nice.
I was curious.
That's nice to hear.
I think he had just a terrific personal touch, either with a phone call to a family that had just experienced something, or just his notes were, and you always saw that handwriting.
Now, he did have an extra person to help him with the notes. He would dictate the notes. He had one regular secretary and one correspondence secretary. And he would pick up the dictaphone and speak out a note, complete with all the punctuation he wanted and everything. And that poor lady would type it up and bring a stack of them in for him to sign. So he did have somebody to help him make that happen.
Good. It's a lot.
What was his reaction to your wanting to be a pastor?
It was positive, but very surprised. He was very surprised because he had something else picked out for me. He thought I was going to be a lawyer. I don't know why. But he would talk about my gifts, and he would say, you speak well, and you're bright, and you read a lot, and he said, I think you should be a lawyer. So I thought, oh, okay, I heard you. And it never really caught fire with me. And then when we got married and we moved to Philadelphia and my husband went to medical school, I suddenly thought, you know what, this is as far as I've thought this through. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life, but I know God gave me gifts and I should be using them. And I agonized and I prayed and I dithered. And one day my husband turned to me and said, in your wildest dreams, what would you do? And I thought, in my wildest dreams, I would be a pastor. And I had no idea when I started that sentence what the end of it was. And when I had said that and thought about it and gone and visited with friends, including our pastor at Bryn Mawr, and gotten some positive feedback, I then told him. And he was surprised, but very supportive and very pleased. And so then he came and visited Princeton Seminary a lot, and he was very good friends with the seminary president at that time. Tom, what was Tom's last name? He's gone on to heaven. They're cooking up all kinds of things up there now. But he was very good friends with him, and he would come to Princeton often. Any other questions and thoughts?
I would just, not to have you close, but when you do close, will you please close with
Sure.
yours? And
I'll
your
be happy
father's
to. I'll be happy to.
We all have a lot of white business,
Yes.
but Wayne and I were going skiing, and the plane was on Sunday, and we were sitting there. And that looks like zero. I got up and went back and Wayne was sitting there. We were told we were going out. He said, "Why aren't you in church?"
I believe it. I hope I never hear the end of those stories. I hear a new one every 2 or 3 days. So would you like me to close? All right, let's close. Friends, go now in peace. Remember that by the goodness of God you were born. Remember that in the mercy of Jesus Christ you have been redeemed. Remember that he walks with you every day to comfort, to strengthen, and to guide. He promised he would. Lo, I am with you always. Remember, while others have called you servants, he has named you friends. Go forth now in the strength of that mighty friendship to serve the Master until we meet again. Amen. Thanks.
Thank you.